The summer our mother died, my sister Vera and I drove out to look at what she'd left us. That was how our cousin Dale put it when he called. What she left us, in a tone that made clear he thought she'd done us no favors. He was right that the property wasn't much to look at. A boarded-up train depot sitting on a gravel clearing off a county road in western Pennsylvania, surrounded by second-growth timber and the kind of silence that collects in places where people used to be but aren't anymore. The building had been decommissioned in 1959, the year our grandfather retired from the railroad. It had been sitting in our family's name, paying nothing, taking nothing, accumulating back taxes that our mother paid every year from her own account with a stubbornness nobody in the family ever fully understood. When she died, she left it to Vera and me and to nobody else. Our brothers were not pleased. There were 4 of us total. Vera and I were the youngest, the only girls, and Raymond and Gerald had always assumed they'd inherit whatever was worth inheriting. The house in Clearfield had gone to all 4 of us equally, and that was fine, they'd accepted that. But the depot, which our mother had always spoken of in a way none of us could quite pin down. Not proudly, not sentimentally, just specifically the way you speak of something that belongs to you and always has, the depot she left only to us. The will was clear. Gerald had hired a lawyer to look at it, and the lawyer said there was nothing to contest. Vera and I owned a crumbling train station on 2.5 acres of Pennsylvania hillside, and our brothers owned their half of a house in town and their resentment, which they carried openly and without embarrassment. What they said, among the family and anyone else who'd listen, was that she'd done it out of sentimentality. Our mother had grown up near the old line. Our grandfather had worked it. The depot had been a fact of her childhood, the way certain buildings become facts. Not loved exactly, but permanent load-bearing. Our brothers figured she'd left it to us because we were the ones who'd visited her most in her last years, the ones who'd sat with her in the evenings and listened to her talk. A sentimental reward for sentimental daughters. That was their interpretation, and it let them be dismissive without feeling guilty about it. Vera's interpretation was simpler. She said Mama knew something. Vera had always been that way. Not mystical, not dramatic, just observant in a way that made you pay attention. She'd noticed things about our mother that the rest of us hadn't. The way she kept a small iron key on a length of cord in her jewelry box for as long as any of us could remember, hung between a cameo brooch and a string of pearls she never wore. The way she'd mention the depot, sometimes in the middle of unrelated conversations, just briefly, almost like a correction, and there's the old station, of course, before moving on to something else. The way she'd paid those back taxes every year without complaint, when there were other years she complained about the cost of her own prescriptions. I thought Vera was building a story around grief. I loved my sister, and I understood that losing our mother meant Vera needed somewhere to put her faith. But I was 53 years old, and I've been a practical woman my whole life, and what I saw when we drove out to the Bells Crossing Depot on a Wednesday morning in late October was a building in serious trouble. The roof had failed in at least 2 places. The platform awning had come partially away from the fascia, and 3 of its support posts were visibly tilted. The windows along the trackside were boarded with plywood that had been there long enough to split and bow, and behind one section of boards the original glass was still intact, or at least it had been before something had struck it from the outside. There was goldenrod growing up through the platform decking. There was a sumac that had gotten into the corner where the freight room abutted the waiting room, and it had pushed the corner boards apart with the patience that only trees have. The front door had a padlock on it, an old padlock, the kind with a steel shackle and a heavy brass body, rusted to the color of an autumn leaf. I stood in front of it with the key from our mother's jewelry box in my hand, and felt something I didn't have a name for yet. The key was iron, small, with a simple bow and a 2-bit that looked too plain to belong to anything worth keeping. I'd assumed it was decorative. I'd assumed it was the kind of thing a woman keeps because it was her mother's or her grandmother's, meaning rather than function, memory rather than mechanism. I fitted it into the padlock because there was nothing else to try, and when I turned it, not easily, not at first, it took 3 attempts and both hands and the kind of focused pressure that leaves marks on your palms. The lock opened with a sound like a bone settling. Vera didn't say anything. She was standing beside me, and she put her hand briefly on my arm, and then she stepped back to let me open the door. The door itself was a problem. 60 years of humidity and freeze-thaw had swelled the frame, and the door fit into it the way a cork fits into a bottle that's been stored sideways. I got my fingers into the gap along the edge and pulled, and nothing happened, and I pulled again with more of my weight behind it, and something groaned inside the wood, and on the third pull the door released all at once, and the smell came out to meet us. Old wood and cold ash, and something underneath both of those things, a dry, closed-in smell, the smell of air that has been waiting. It wasn't unpleasant. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed, not abandoned. There is a difference, though I couldn't have articulated it that morning. We stepped inside together. The waiting room was smaller than I'd pictured. A long bench along one wall, its slats still solid though gray with age. A pot-belly stove in the far corner, rusted but upright. The floor was dark slate, and leaves had blown in under the gap at the bottom of the door over the years, and dried to nothing and blown in again and dried again, so there were several seasons of them layered in the corners. The ticket window was intact, the wooden frame, the small iron grate, the shallow counter worn smooth where 1,000 hands had slid money across it and 1,000 other hands had slid tickets back. Above the window there was a chalkboard, and on the chalkboard, in chalk that had somehow survived the decades without being entirely erased, were the remnants of a schedule. Departures, a time in the morning, a line that might have read Connellsville or might have read something else. The chalk was too far gone to be certain. I stopped at the threshold between the waiting room and the agent station. Vera kept walking. She walked the way she'd always walked into rooms she wasn't sure about, slowly, with her hands at her sides, like she was giving the room a chance to decide whether it wanted her. She went behind the agent's counter and stood at the bay window that jutted out toward the old track bed, the window that would have given the station agent his sight line down the platform. The glass was intact here, on the interior side at least. The afternoon light came through it at a low angle and lit the dust in the air, and Vera stood in it without moving for a moment, and then she said, very quietly, "Look at the floor." I went around behind the counter to stand beside her. The floorboards were pine, dark with age, worn smooth by decades of feet. Most of them ran perpendicular to the window, east to west, continuous planks that had shrunk in their gaps over time the way old wood does. But there was one section, roughly square, perhaps 2 feet on each side, positioned directly beneath the high-backed agent's chair, where the gaps were different. Not the irregular shrinkage of old wood, but something straighter, more deliberate. The gaps ran in 4 clean lines, forming a near-perfect rectangle, and the boards within that rectangle were fractionally higher than the boards around them, enough that the difference was visible in the low afternoon light as a very faint shadow. I don't know how Vera saw it. I don't know whether I would have seen it without her. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it, and I found myself kneeling on the floor of a 60-year-old train station, running my fingers along the seam the way you check a seal you suspect isn't solid. The seam was deliberate. I was certain within a few seconds. The cuts were too clean, the corners too square. This was not how floors failed or settled. This was a panel, a fitted trapdoor, sized to sit flush within the floor and pass unnoticed unless the light was exactly right, and you were looking for exactly this. The boards were joined by something I couldn't see, hidden hinges or a runner on the underside, and there was no visible hardware on top, no pull, no indication at all of how it was meant to be opened. I went out to the car and found the tire iron in the trunk. When I came back, Vera was still kneeling, her palm flat on the panel, feeling something I couldn't feel. I slid the flat end of the tire iron into the gap on the south edge and applied pressure slowly, the way you open anything old and unknown, carefully, with respect for what you don't yet understand. The panel lifted. Not easily, not all at once. There was resistance, the resistance of something that has been sealed for a very long time and is not certain it wants to be opened. And then it came up, hinged on the north edge, and swung back and held itself open on a prop mechanism inside that was still functional, a simple wooden dowel dropping into a notch. The smell that came out of the space below was different from the smell of the room above. Drier, closer, the smell of a very small, very sealed place. Cedar, faintly, and something mineral like old coins. We both looked down into the recess without speaking. It was a box in the truest sense. A cavity built between the floor beams, roughly 2 feet square and perhaps 8 inches deep, lined on 3 sides with cedar planking and access from above through the panel we'd just opened. Inside the cavity, there were 3 things. A tin box, the old kind, painted black, with a hinged lid and a simple clasp. A bundle of papers tied with twine that had gone brittle. And a cloth-wrapped package, the cloth of faded blue-gray that might have been any color once, tied with a cord that had shrunk and hardened until it was almost rigid. I reached in and lifted the tin box first. It was heavier than it looked. I sat on the agent's counter and stood looking at it for a moment before I opened the clasp. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, so old it was nearly transparent, were coins. Silver dollars, each one individually wrapped, each one resting in a small compartment that had been cut into a piece of cork fitted to the interior of the box. There were 14 of them. Beside the compartments, filling the remaining space in the tin, was a quantity of folded paper bills. Old bills, not collector's items, just money that had been put away in a box and left. 10s and 20s and a few 50s, held in paper bands that had dried and cracked. I didn't count it that afternoon. I didn't have the presence of mind. Vera was already lifting the cloth-wrapped package with both hands, setting it on the counter beside the tin. She untied the cord carefully, working the knots loose rather than cutting them, and unfolded the cloth. Inside was a railroad watch. A pocket watch, larger than a standard movement, in a plain nickel-silver case, the kind that railroad men had been required to carry by regulation. Accurate to within 30 seconds per week, adjusted for temperature variation, built for the work of keeping trains on time. The case was scratched from use, but not damaged. The crystal was intact. I reached out and picked it up and turned it over, and on the back someone had engraved 3 initials and a year. WAB 1941. Vera picked up the paper bundle and untied the twine, which came apart in her hands more than it was untied. Inside were letters, not many, perhaps 7 or 8, folded individually, and on top of the stack, loose, a single envelope addressed in handwriting that was careful and old-fashioned. On the front of the envelope, in ink that had gone brown with age, were 4 words that stopped both of us completely. For whoever comes last. If this story is already pulling at something in you, hit the like button and subscribe to Left Behind, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. She had almost nothing left. No one knew what was waiting. Keep watching. Vera set the envelope down on the counter, and we both looked at it without touching it for what felt like a long time. Outside, through the bay window, the light was moving across the old track bed, and in it you could almost see the shape of where the rails had been, the slight depression in the ground, the gravel mixed with weeds where the ballast had settled. A woodpecker somewhere in the tree line. The buildings settling slightly, the way old buildings do when the temperature drops in the afternoon. The tin box sitting on the counter with its coins and its money. The watch in my hand, still keeping no time at all, the hands arrested at 3:10. I understood, in that moment, something I'd been turning over since we'd pulled off the county road and parked on the gravel clearing and looked at this building for the first time. Our mother had not paid those back taxes for 30 years out of sentiment. She hadn't driven out here on her own, and she had, the neighbors confirmed it later, she'd been seen out here on her own at least twice that anyone remembered, out of nostalgia or stubbornness or the particular refusal of old women to let things go that their children have always found inexplicable. She'd paid because she knew something was here. She kept that iron key on the cord in her jewelry box because someday someone was going to need it. And she'd left the property to Vera and me, not to Raymond, not to Gerald, because she trusted us to open the door and not be the kind of people who saw only what something was worth and missed entirely what it meant. I set the watch down on the counter beside the tin box and picked up the envelope. Vera put her hand on my arm again, the same way she had at the door, not stopping me, just present. I opened the envelope. The paper inside was good paper, heavy, the kind that held ink well and held decades better. The handwriting was the same as the address. Careful, precise, the handwriting of someone who'd spent a life filling out forms and records and understood that what you wrote down was what survived you. At the top of the page, a name and a date. Walter A. Binford, station agent, Bells Crossing branch stop. October 14th, 1958. I am writing this in the last week this station will operate, as the line has been sold and the branch discontinued effective the 1st of November. I have worked at this station for 22 years. I have no family living and no particular place to go, but I am not a man who leaves things in disorder, and so I'm setting this down before I leave for whoever comes after me, if anyone does. The money in the tin box is mine, saved over 22 years of work at this station. I have kept it here because I have kept it everywhere I've ever worked, under my chair, in the floor, where I can hear it if someone disturbs it and where I can reach it without standing up. Old habit. I do not trust banks in the way some people do not trust certain dogs. They have given me reason. The watch belonged to my father and to his father before him. It is a railroad watch, adjusted for temperature and running true. I wind it every morning. Whoever finds this should know that a watch kept wound is a watch that knows it's expected to keep working. I don't know who will find this. I don't know when. I've thought about it, and I've decided it doesn't matter. This station was built in 1901. It was built to last. Whatever it becomes after the railroad lets it go, it will still be a building that was once a place where people waited for something to arrive, and that seems to me like a decent thing for a building to have been. The letters in the bundle are mine as well. Private letters from my wife, who died in 1949. I've kept them here because this is where I've spent most of my days since she died, and this is where I feel least alone. If you were reading this, I would ask you to burn them unread as a courtesy to a man who had little else to call his own. Use the money for whatever the building needs. The coins are silver and will be worth something whenever you find them. The watch should go to someone who understands what it means to be on time. Take care of this place if you can. It was a good station. It kept good time. Walter A. Binford. Vera had been reading over my shoulder. When I finished, neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Vera said, very quietly, the way she said things she'd already thought through completely, "Mama, read this." I looked at her. She read it, Vera said again. She knew what was here. That's why she kept the key. I turned and looked at the open floor panel, the cedar-lined cavity, the prop holding the trapdoor open. I thought about our mother driving out here on her own, the 2 times the neighbors had seen her. I thought about the iron key on the cord in her jewelry box, between the brooch and the pearls. I thought about the way she'd paid the taxes every year without complaint, the way she'd left the property to us specifically, the way she'd mentioned it in conversations as though correcting the record. And there's the old station, of course, making sure we knew it existed, making sure we remembered. She hadn't told us what was here. She'd waited until she couldn't anymore, and then she'd left us the key and the deed and trusted us to open the door and read the letter and understand what she'd understood, standing in this same room, running her hand over the same panel, lifting the same tin box and holding the same watch. Whoever comes last. We were not the last. We were what came after last, which is a different thing. We were what the station agent hadn't been able to imagine when he sealed this floor and wrote his letter and walked out of this building in October of 1958. He'd written it for the next person, and the next person had been our mother, and she'd read it and understood it and kept the secret and kept the key and paid the taxes, and finally, when she had no more time left, she'd passed it to us. I held the letter for a long time. The woodpecker was still working somewhere in the tree line. The light through the bay window had shifted again, lower now, longer, the particular amber of a late October afternoon that has started moving toward evening without asking anyone's permission. We didn't tell our brothers that day. We didn't tell anyone. We put the tin box and the watch and the letters back into the cavity, set the panel back into the floor, and locked the front door behind us with the iron key. We sat in the car on the gravel clearing for a while, without starting the engine. The tree line had gone dark against the sky. Vera had her hands folded in her lap and was looking at the depot the way she looked at things she was deciding about. "We need to know what the coins are worth," she said finally. "And we need to get someone to look at the roof before winter." That was Vera. Not "can you believe this?" or "what do we do?" or any of the circular wondering I would have done on my own. Just the next 2 things in order. We drove back to Clearfield and ate dinner at the kitchen table of our mother's house. which still smelled like her, like the particular soap she'd used and the cedar sachets she kept in the closet, and something underneath both of those things that was just her, the smell of a person's life accumulated in the walls of the place they've lived. Raymond had been by earlier in the week and moved some boxes to the basement. Gerald had taken the television, which was within his rights and which bothered me more than it should have. The house felt redistributed, things slightly off from where they'd always been. The particular grief of a house that is in the process of becoming something other than what it was. I told Vera what I'd been thinking in the car. What I'd been thinking was that our mother had made a choice when she found that letter. She'd read Walter Benford's instructions, used the money for whatever the building needs, and she decided to honor them in her own way, which meant keeping the secret and keeping the building and paying the taxes year after year so that the building was still there when it was time to pass it on. She hadn't spent the money. She hadn't sold the coins. She hadn't told a soul, as far as we could determine. She'd done exactly what the letter asked, except that she'd added her own interpretation of the instructions, which was that the building needed time more than it needed anything else. It needed to still be standing. She'd bought at that time one tax payment per year for as long as she could. Vera listened to all of this and then said, she also needed us to be old enough. I looked at her. When she found it, Vera said, we were what? In our 20s. She needed us to be the kind of people who could handle it. She was waiting until we were ready. I didn't know whether that was true. I still don't entirely. But it sounded like our mother, which is sometimes the closest you can get to the truth about someone who isn't there to confirm it. We had the coins appraised the following week by a dealer in State College who specialized in numismatics and who looked at our 14 silver dollars with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who genuinely loves what he does. 10 of them were Morgan dollars from the 1880s and 1890s. 3 were peace dollars from the 1920s. 1 was older than the others, an 1872 seated Liberty dollar in condition the dealer described as extraordinary, which was a word he used quietly, like he was trying not to startle it. He gave us a written valuation. The number was not what we'd expected. The 14 coins, taken together, were worth considerably more than the paper money in the tin box, and the paper money, once we'd counted and identified it, was not nothing. Walter Benford had been a man of modest means and extraordinary patience, and the coins under his chair had appreciated for 60 years in a cedar-lined box in a sealed floor. We did not call our brothers. What we did instead was hire a structural engineer named Patrice, a woman in her 50s who drove out from Altoona on a cold November morning and walked every inch of the building with a flashlight and a clipboard and the brisk, unsentimental attention of someone who has made a career of telling people what their buildings actually are rather than what they hope them to be. She tapped walls and tested joists and climbed carefully into the space under the collapsed section of roof and came back out with sawdust in her hair and a look on her face that I couldn't read until she started talking. The waiting room and the agent station were structurally sound. The foundation, which was local fieldstone laid in the 1890s, was in remarkable condition. She used that word specifically, remarkable, and unlike the coin dealer, she said it with mild exasperation. The way an engineer says it when a building is older than her professional experience with buildings has prepared her for. The 2 areas of roof failure were both in the freight room, which had been an addition to the original structure, added in the 1920s with materials and methods that had not held up as well as the original work. The platform awning was cosmetic trouble, not structural. The windows were reparable. The floor, she said, walking across the agent station without knowing what was underneath it, was as solid as the day it was laid. Vera and I sat in the car after Patrice drove away and looked at the estimate she'd left us, which was substantial but not impossible. The freight room roof was the significant expense. Everything else was restoration work, patient and expensive, but not beyond reach. We can do it, Vera said. With what? I asked, which was not pessimism, just arithmetic. We both had lives, jobs, houses of our own. The estate was still in probate. The paper money from the tin box would cover perhaps a third of the structural work. The coins, Vera said. I looked at her. He said, use the money for whatever the building needs, she said. The coins are the money. The building needs the roof. I thought about Walter Benford writing that letter in October of 1958, alone in a building he'd worked in for 22 years, putting his life's savings into a tin box and leaving it under the floor for whoever came next. I thought about what he'd meant by whatever the building needs. I thought it was possible he'd meant exactly what Vera said. We sold 4 of the Morgan dollars. Not the best ones, not the 1872 seated Liberty, which we kept wrapped in its tissue paper in the tin box, which we kept in my closet at home. 4 coins, sold to the dealer in State College who gave us fair prices without pressuring us and who asked, when we came back, how the building was coming along. We told him. He said he had a grandfather who'd worked the Pensy and that there was something right about silver dollars going back into a railroad station. We thanked him and drove home with a check that covered the freight room roof and left enough over to begin on the windows. If this story has found its way to you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Left Behind. Your support is what keeps these stories coming, and there are so many more waiting to be told. The work began in January. The roofing crew was local, 3 men from a small outfit in Phillipsburg who did agricultural buildings and old structures and who had the practical knowledge of people who work on things built before anyone thought about building codes. They replaced the failed sections of the freight room roof with materials that matched the original as closely as possible. Not because anyone required it, but because Vera asked them to, and because once you start caring about a thing, you find that caring tends to be specific. They were back the following week to address the awning, and the week after that one of them, a man named Dwight who turned out to have grown up 2 townships over, came back on his own time on a Saturday and began working on the platform decking without being asked. He said he'd driven past that building his whole life, and it would be a shame to lose the platform. We did not announce what we were doing. We did not post photographs or tell the story publicly or explain ourselves to anyone who asked. And people did ask, because a building that has been boarded up for 60 years does not quietly resume looking like a building without attracting attention along the county road. We told people we'd inherited it and were stabilizing it. We told them we didn't know yet what it would become. Both of those things were true. Our brothers found out in February, when Gerald happened to drive past on a day when the roofing crew's truck was parked on the clearing and the sound of work was audible from the road. He called me that evening. His tone was the tone he'd perfected over 50 years of being the oldest and being wrong about things without fully accepting it. Not quite angry, not quite accusatory, something in between that functioned as both. He said he thought we should have a family conversation about the property. He said there were decisions being made that affected all of them. I said the property belonged to Vera and me and that we were maintaining it, which was straightforwardly what inheritors of property were supposed to do. He said the costs of maintenance should be shared. I told him the costs were being covered. He asked by what, and I told him by money that had come with the property, which was true and which answered his question without answering it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Mama should have left it to all of them equally, that it wasn't fair. I thought about our mother driving out to that clearing on her own, twice that the neighbors had seen, and perhaps more times than that. I thought about her standing in that agent station with the iron key in her hand, reading Walter Benford's letter, understanding what she'd found and deciding what to do with it. I thought about 30 years of back taxes paid without complaint or explanation. I told Gerald that Mama had made her decision and we were honoring it, and that if he wanted to come see the building sometime, he was welcome to. He said he'd think about it. He didn't come that winter. Raymond didn't come either. That was all right. Some things you have to be ready for, and they weren't ready yet, and some readiness can't be rushed. By March, the roof was finished and the windows were reglazed, and the potbelly stove in the waiting room had been cleaned out by Vera, who discovered in the process that the chimney was still functional and that a small fire in that stove on a cold afternoon heated the waiting room to something close to comfortable. She started a fire one Saturday when we were both there working, and we sat on a long bench and drank coffee from a thermos, and the light came through the bay window at the angle that hit the floor at the right moment, and we could see, very faintly, the outline of the panel. Still there, still flush, waiting for whatever came next the same way it had been waiting for 60 years, patient as old pine. Spring came the way it comes to that part of Pennsylvania, slowly, then all at once, the hillsides going from gray to green over the course of about 2 weeks in April, as though the trees had been waiting for a signal and finally received it. The gravel clearing around the depot dried out, and the goldenrod that had been pushing up through the platform decking got cut back, and the name board above the door, Bell's Crossing, white letters on dark blue, barely legible when we'd first arrived, got repainted by Vera on a warm Saturday in May. She didn't change anything. She matched the colors exactly, the same dark blue, the same white, the same plain lettering. She said if Walter Benford had looked at that sign every morning for 22 years, it seemed wrong to change it now. We burned the letters, as he'd asked. We did it on a still evening in April, in a small fire in the clearing, and we didn't read them first. That part was not difficult. Vera said a person's private grief deserved its privacy, and I agreed, and we watched the paper go and didn't speak much. The tin box we kept. The 1872 seeded Liberty Dollar we kept. The railroad watch we kept wound, as the letter had instructed, setting it each morning by Vera's phone and listening to it tick through the afternoons we spent in the building. In June, something happened that neither of us had planned for. A man stopped his truck on the county road on a Thursday afternoon and walked across the clearing to where Vera was working on the platform railing. He was older, perhaps 75, wearing a canvas jacket despite the warmth, and he stood at the edge of the platform for a moment before he spoke, looking at the building the way people look at things they remember from a long time ago. He said his name was Carl Osterhaus. He said his father had been a freight agent on the branch line in the 1950s and had known the man who ran Bell's Crossing Station. He said he'd driven past this building probably 1,000 times in his life and had assumed it was going to fall down eventually, and that he'd stop today because it appeared, unexpectedly, not to be falling down. Vera told him we'd inherited it and were restoring it. He asked what we intended to do with it. Vera said we weren't entirely sure yet. He nodded at that in the way of someone who finds an honest answer more satisfying than a confident one. Then he said he had a box of photographs in his basement, his father's, that included several taken at Bell's Crossing in the early 1950s. Interior photographs. The waiting room, the agent station, the freight room in working order. He'd kept them because he hadn't known what else to do with them, and throwing them away had felt wrong. He brought them the following week. There were 11 photographs, black and white, printed on the heavy paper of that era. The waiting room with its bench and its stove, both passengers and freight visible through the window. The agent station with a man sitting at the counter in the bay window, not Walter Benford, too young, probably a predecessor, probably the 1940s based on the clothing. The freight room stacked with crates and burlap sacks. The platform on what appeared to be a summer morning, a train stopped alongside it, 2 people waiting, a third leaning out a passenger car door. And one photograph taken from inside the agent station looking toward the window, the bay window, the light coming through it at the low angle we knew. We had stood in exactly that light, both of us multiple times, and in the foreground, just visible at the bottom of the frame, the agent's chair, and beneath the chair the floor. The panel was visible, just barely, just as a slightly different quality of shadow, running in 4 straight lines, but visible once you knew to look, which we did. Vera looked at that photograph for a long time. Then she looked at Carl Osterhaus and said, "Did your father ever mention anything unusual about the building?" Carl thought about it. Then he said that his father had said the station agent at Bell's Crossing was a private man who kept his own counsel and ran a clean station. He said his father had respected him. He didn't know anything beyond that. We showed Carl the cavity in the floor. We showed him the tin box and the watch and told him about the letter. He sat in the agent's chair for a moment after we told him, which seemed right. An old man in the chair of a building his father had known, in the building that a man his father had respected had sealed carefully before walking away from it. He held the watch in both hands. He said his father would have been glad to know the building was still standing. He asked if he could bring his daughter sometime. We said of course. That was how it started. Not with a plan or an announcement, but with one man stopping his truck on a county road, because something looked different than it had before. Carl brought his daughter, who brought her husband, who turned out to know a retired railroad historian at Penn State who drove out in July with 2 graduate students and spent an entire day in the building taking careful notes and asking careful questions. The historian confirmed what we'd suspected about the construction date and told us things about the branch line we hadn't known. The communities it had served, the freight it had carried, the particular character of small branch depots like this one, built for function and modest in their ambitions, and outlasting the lines they'd served by decades simply because no one had gotten around to demolishing them. Raymond came in August. He called first, which surprised me, and he came alone, which surprised me more. He stood in the waiting room and looked at the bench and the stove and the repainted name board visible through the door, which we'd begun leaving open on warm days, and he didn't say much for a while. Then he said it was something, wasn't it? I said it was. He walked to the bay window and looked out at the track bed, the way people look at something they can almost but not quite picture in its original form. He asked about the structural work, what it had cost, how we paid for it. I told him honestly. He listened without interrupting, which was not his habit. When I finished, he said that Mama had known what she was doing. I said yes. He said he supposed she usually had. I said yes to that too, and let it sit there between us without adding anything to it, because some acknowledgments don't need help. Gerald came in September with his wife, who had always been warmer than he was, and who walked through the building with her hands clasped, and said it was the most extraordinary thing she'd seen in years, which loosened something in Gerald that his own composure wouldn't have allowed. He stood at the open floor panel. We'd been showing it to visitors by then, lifting it carefully and letting people see the cedar-lined cavity, the shallow shelf, the place where three things had waited in the dark for 60 years. And he stood looking into it for a long time. He said, finally, that he hadn't understood why she'd left it to us. I said I knew. He said he understood now. I didn't tell him what Vera had said, that she needed us to be old enough, that she'd been waiting until we were ready. It seemed like the kind of thing a person should arrive at in their own time, and Gerald was arriving at it, slowly, standing in a train station in September with his hands in his pockets, which was as close as Gerald got as standing humbly anywhere. The watch stayed on the agent's counter. We kept it wound. Visitors sometimes asked about it, and we told them the story, or as much of the story as felt right to tell, which changed slightly depending on who was asking and what they seemed to need from it. The coins stayed in the tin box in the cavity, with the panel closed over them. All but the 4 we'd sold, and the ones we'd used for the roof, which felt like the right use for them, felt like exactly what Walter Benford had intended when he wrote use the money for whatever the building needs. The building had needed its roof. The coins had provided it. That seemed like a clean transaction between a man who was gone and a place that was still standing. In October, a year after we'd first driven out and stood on the gravel clearing and looked at the boarded windows, Vera and I sat on the platform bench that Dwight had rebuilt in the spring, the one that faced the old track bed, and drank coffee from the same thermos we'd used that first winter morning in the waiting room. The light was doing what October light does in Pennsylvania, going gold and long and making everything look like it's being seen for the last time and also for the first time simultaneously. The tree line had turned. The goldenrod was finished. The building behind us was warm from the afternoon sun on its south wall, and if you put your hand flat against the boards you could feel it, that stored warmth, the way old buildings hold heat in their walls, the way old people hold certain memories, not on the surface, but deep in the material, in the grain of the thing. Vera said, she sat here. I looked at her. When she came out by herself, Vera said, she would have sat here. I thought about that. I thought about our mother driving out on her own, parking on the clearing, unlocking the door with the iron key, walking through the waiting room to the agent station, lifting the panel, reading the letter. And then, perhaps, sitting here, on a bench on a platform where trains hadn't stopped in 60 years, drinking whatever she'd brought, looking out at where the rails had been, understanding that she'd been trusted with something and deciding, quietly, without telling anyone, how she was going to honor that trust. She had been a practical woman, our mother, not cold, not unsentimental, but practical in the way that women of her generation often were. She'd learned early that sentiment without action was just feeling sorry for yourself, and she'd had no patience for it. What she'd done with Walter Benford's letter was the most practical thing imaginable. She'd kept the building standing. She'd kept the key. She'd passed it to the people she trusted to understand it. What is left behind is never truly gone. It only waits for the hand it was meant for. Walter Benford had understood that when he sealed that floor in 1958, writing his letter on good paper, in careful handwriting for someone he'd never imagined and could not name. Our mother had understood it when she lifted that panel and read those words and drove home and put the iron key on the cord in her jewelry box where it stayed for 30 years. And we understood it now, sitting on a rebuilt platform bench in October, the building warm behind us, the track bed running straight and empty through the goldenrod toward whatever it had once connected and connected still, in the way that things persist, not in their function, but in the fact of their having been. The watch on the counter inside was keeping time. We'd wound it that morning, as we wound it every morning we were there, because a watch kept wound is a watch that knows it's expected to keep working. We didn't know yet what the building would fully become. There were conversations still to have with the Historical Society, with the township, with the railroad historian who'd asked in July whether we'd considered some form of public access. Said it carefully, not pushing, just offering. Those conversations would come. The roof was sound. The floor was solid. The name board said what it had always said. Whatever came next would come the way the spring had come, slowly and then all at once, because that is how things arrive when the ground has been properly prepared for them. We sat on the platform until the light went. Then we went inside, and Vera locked the door behind us, and I put the iron key in my coat pocket where I could feel it against my ribs as we walked across the gravel to the car, small and solid and warm from my hand, keeping nothing and meaning everything. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. The people who stay for the whole story are the ones who understand it. If it moved you, the videos on your screen right now are waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come home. Left Behind has a story for you.